Jake Morrison's old pickup truck crept slowly through the blizzard, the tires crunching against the thick snow that had started to pile up hours ago. The howling wind whipped across the desolate landscape, the Wyoming wilderness as unforgiving as ever. But Jake, a man seasoned by 4 decades of ranching in this harsh land, was no stranger to the storms. He'd lived through countless blizzards, each one more brutal than the last. But this one felt different. Beside him sat his 2 oldest friends, Tom and Miguel. Tom was a man of few words, his weathered face a map of the years spent battling the elements. Miguel, on the other hand, had a fire to him. The youngest of the 3 at 35, he had grown up around horses, learning the ropes of ranch life from his father back in New Mexico. Now, he stood beside Jake in this storm, helping him search for a missing herd of cattle that had wandered off in the blizzard. The wind picked up again, howling louder as it slammed into the truck, forcing Jake to squint against the snowstorm. He could barely make out the silhouette of the land, the hills blurring in the whiteout. "There's something out there." Miguel's voice broke through the silence, urgent and sharp. Jake slammed his foot on the brakes. The truck slid slightly on the icy ground, but he managed to bring it to a stop. Snowflakes pelted against the windshield, and through the frosted glass he could just barely make out a dark shape lying in the distance. "What is it?" Tom's voice was low, cautious. He squinted through the windshield, trying to focus on the figure. "I don't know. Let's go check," Jake said, his tone serious. They piled out of the truck, the cold instantly biting at their exposed skin. Miguel adjusted his jacket and pulled his hat lower over his ears. "Stay close," Jake muttered, already stepping through the snow, his boots crunching heavily as he moved toward the dark shape. They trekked carefully through the deep snow, the wind slicing across their faces. As they got closer, the shape resolved into something large, something much larger than a cow. Jake's heart skipped a beat as he realized it was a horse, a wild Mustang. Jake knew wild horses well. He had worked with them for years, respected them, feared them. But this Mustang wasn't just any horse. This one was lying motionless in the snow, its breathing shallow and labored. "Is he alive?" Tom asked, his voice barely audible over the wind. Jake knelt carefully, wary of spooking the horse. He reached out, his gloved hand brushing the Mustang's side. The horse flinched but didn't move. Its black coat was nearly hidden beneath the snow, but Jake could make out the dark eyes watching him from beneath a lowered head. "He's alive," Jake murmured, straightening up. "But something's wrong." The Mustang's legs were tucked beneath him unnaturally, as though the horse was deliberately keeping himself in place. His head was down, resting on the frozen ground, his eyes tracking their movements with an intensity that made the hair on Jake's neck stand up. Miguel took a cautious step forward, his voice full of concern. "Why isn't he trying to get up?" "Even injured horses usually try to stand, especially when humans approach," Jake answered, his brow furrowed. "This one's different." As Jake moved around the Mustang, he noticed something strange. The snow beneath the horse seemed disturbed, as if the Mustang had been sheltering something smaller, hidden beneath his body. "Look," Jake said softly, pointing to the depression in the snow. "This horse is guarding something." The 3 men stood still, the weight of the moment settling over them. The Mustang's eyes flicked between them, still alert, but seemingly exhausted. In a rare show of trust, Jake slowly extended a hand toward the stallion, speaking softly in a calm, reassuring voice. "It's okay, big guy. We're not here to hurt you," Jake said, his voice low and gentle. The Mustang's nostrils flared, and he gave a weak, low grunt, a sound that wasn't quite a whinny, but more like a plea. Jake's stomach tightened. This wasn't just a wounded animal. It was a protector. "What the hell is he guarding?" Miguel asked, his voice tight with confusion. "I don't know," Jake replied, squinting at the snow around the Mustang's body. "But I think it's something important." The stallion shifted slightly, giving them just enough of a glimpse to reveal the smaller form beneath him. There, hidden beneath the protective cover of the Mustang's body, was a foal, its small brown body barely visible under the stallion's form. Jake's heart skipped. The foal was unconscious, its breathing shallow, its coat patchy and covered in snow. "Jesus," Tom whispered, stepping back. "He's protecting a baby." The revelation sent a jolt of understanding through the group. Jake's mind raced, piecing the situation together. This Mustang, this wild stallion, was using his own body as a shield to protect the baby from the storm. It was a sight so rare and so selfless that it seemed almost unreal. But time was running out. The storm raged on, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. Jake knew they had to act quickly, or they might lose both the stallion and the foal. "Look at him," Miguel said, his voice full of awe. "This Mustang is a hero." Jake nodded grimly. He had seen many wild horses in his years on the ranch, but this was different. This was more than just survival. This was a profound act of sacrifice. This was a protector doing whatever it took to ensure the survival of the next generation. The storm howled around them, and Jake felt a sudden urgency. They needed to help the Mustang, but they couldn't do it without risking the foal's life. Moving the stallion could make things worse. He could panic, or worse, refuse to let them near the foal. But doing nothing wasn't an option. The foal was depending on them. "We can't leave them out here," Jake said, his voice hard with determination. "We need to get them both out of this storm." Tom and Miguel exchanged looks, and without a word, they moved to gather supplies from the truck. Jake stayed by the horses, watching them closely. The Mustang's eyes remained locked on him, but the tension was palpable. He was still alert, but exhausted. His body shook with the cold, his muscles twitching with every breath. Jake took a deep breath and made a decision. He needed to calm the Mustang, to convince him that they weren't a threat. Slowly, he crouched down and pulled out a bag of emergency grain from his pack. He spread a small pile of it in the snow just out of reach of the Mustang. The scent of the grain wafted into the air, and Jake watched carefully as the Mustang's nostrils flared. It was a calculated risk. Jake needed to build trust with the horse, and food was often the way to a horse's heart. The Mustang hesitated, clearly torn between his hunger and his protective instincts. "Come on, boy," Jake said quietly. "We're friends here." The stallion's eyes flickered between the grain and the men, his instincts clearly at war. But after what felt like an eternity, he lowered his head and nuzzled the grain. It was the opening Jake needed. As the Mustang focused on the grain, Jake's heart raced. The trust was fragile, but it was enough to make a move. With the Mustang distracted, Jake carefully shifted closer, his hand steady as he reached for the foal beneath the stallion. The wind howled, louder now, as the snowstorm continued to rage around them. The harsh Wyoming weather was unforgiving, and the urgency of the situation was growing clearer by the minute. Jake kept his eyes on the Mustang, whose dark, intense gaze never left him. The old stallion's chest rose and fell with shallow, strained breaths, and despite the grain now lying in the snow before him, the Mustang still didn't seem willing to fully let his guard down. Jake swallowed hard, watching as the stallion hesitated, inching his head toward the grain, but never fully relaxing. His body, however, seemed to be weakening with every passing second. The snow on his back was beginning to pile higher, the stallion's thick black coat only able to keep the elements at bay for so long. The sight of him, a once proud guardian of the wild, now fighting against the cold, made Jake's heart heavy with sorrow. Tom and Miguel had returned from the truck with supplies, their faces grim under the weight of the situation. Tom, as always, was the first to speak. "We need to move fast, Jake. He's barely hanging on," Tom said, his voice low but urgent. The first aid kit and emergency blankets were in his hands, and the cold had already started to take its toll on his fingers, but he didn't let it show. Miguel, the youngest of the trio but a rancher in his own right, nodded silently as he crouched down beside Jake. He placed a hand on the Mustang's shoulder gently, careful not to spook him. "We can't keep waiting," Miguel said, his eyes shifting to the foal beneath the stallion. "This little one's life depends on us." Jake nodded, his gaze never leaving the Mustangs. He had seen animals in desperate situations before, injured, scared, and close to death. But the bond between this stallion and the foal beneath him was something Jake had never seen before. The stallion wasn't just struggling to survive, he was struggling for something else entirely. The storm roared louder, the wind cutting through the small gap in their makeshift shelter. The temperature was plummeting, and every breath they took felt like inhaling ice. The urgency of the moment was becoming unbearable. "We need to move him," Jake said, his voice firm now, carrying the weight of his decision. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew this wasn't going to be easy. The Mustang wasn't just injured, he was determined to protect the foal at all costs. Miguel glanced at the foal, whose tiny body remained still beneath the Mustang, its fragile form barely visible under the dark shape of the stallion. The foal's breathing was shallow, and the snow around it was stained a faint reddish color, likely from the blood seeping from the Mustang's wounds. The sight made Miguel's stomach churn. Jake stepped forward slowly, pulling the emergency grain bag closer. The Mustang's nostrils flared as he sniffed the air, clearly torn between his hunger and his protective instincts. It was clear the stallion was weakening, but Jake had seen this kind of behavior before. Horses like this were driven by an undeniable sense of duty. Even in their final moments, they would protect what they loved with everything they had. Tom, who had been carefully preparing the first aid kit, stepped beside Jake. "We're not going to make it if we don't act now," he said, his voice tight with worry. "This storm isn't letting up, and we're already losing ground. We need to help both of them, and fast." Jake nodded, his jaw clenched. His experience with wild horses had taught him one thing: they could be unpredictable, especially when they were protecting something, or someone. But the Mustang had already shown signs of trust. The grain had worked for now. The stallion had relaxed his stance enough to allow Jake to come closer. The next step, though, was the hardest. Jake needed to gently coax the Mustang into moving. He couldn't force him. That would break the fragile trust they had started to build. He needed to make the Mustang understand that the foal's survival was in their hands, not his. "Hey, big guy," Jake said, keeping his voice steady and low. He crouched down beside the Mustang, extending his hand slowly toward his flank. "I know you're tired. I know you're scared. But we're here to help. We'll take care of him. You did your part." For a long moment, the Mustang didn't respond. His eyes were filled with an intensity that spoke of years of survival in the wild, of battles fought, of families protected. He let out a soft, low nicker, a sound that seemed almost like a question. Jake's heart tightened. The stallion wasn't just a protector, he was a father too. With a deep breath, Jake made his move. He reached forward and placed a firm but gentle hand on the Mustang's back, feeling the shudder of his muscles beneath his touch. He could feel the heat of the horse's body, an old, battle-worn body that had held strong for so long. The Mustang's coat was matted and wet from the snow, but his body heat was still there, strong enough to protect the foal, even at the expense of his own survival. Slowly, Jake pushed his hand downward, urging the Mustang to shift just enough to reveal the foal beneath. The Mustang let out a low, almost defeated sound, but complied, his body slowly shifting to the side. The moment the foal was partially exposed, Jake's heart skipped a beat. The baby horse was tiny, too small to have survived long in the harsh winter storm. Its coat was damp and cold, its fragile body barely breathing. The foal's eyes fluttered weakly as it tried to lift its head, but collapsed back into the snow. Jake cursed under his breath. "We need to get him warm," Jake said urgently. He turned to Miguel. "Help me with the blankets. We've got to move fast." Miguel nodded, grabbing the emergency blankets from the bag. Together, they wrapped the foal in the warm fabric, trying to preserve whatever heat they could. Jake's eyes flicked back to the Mustang. The stallion was still standing beside them, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. His breathing had become more shallow, his body trembling with the effort of staying upright. Jake could see the bloodstains on his legs, the deep gashes that had been inflicted during the storm. The Mustang's wounds were worse than he had initially realized. "Tom," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. "We need to stabilize him too. I don't know how much longer he's got." Tom didn't hesitate. He pulled out the medical supplies and moved toward the Mustang, but he stopped short when the stallion gave a low warning growl. "We're not a threat," Jake said softly, placing a hand on Tom's shoulder. He stepped closer to the Mustang. "We just need to help, old friend. You've done enough." With a cautious but steady hand, Jake placed his fingers on the Mustang's neck, feeling the heat radiating from his skin. He could feel the weight of the stallion's exhaustion, the years of survival taking their toll. But Jake knew the Mustang wasn't done yet. He had one last act of heroism left. As the men worked to stabilize the foal, the Mustang shifted once again, slowly stepping forward and nuzzling the baby. His eyes softened as he licked the foal's small, fragile body. The connection between them was undeniable. The Mustang wasn't just protecting a foal, he was giving his last act of love, of sacrifice. "I think he knows he's done all he can," Tom said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Jake nodded, his throat tight with the weight of the moment. "He's a hero." But even heroes had their limits, and the Mustang, no matter how strong, was running out of time. The wind had begun to die down, but the storm's aftermath was still biting at their exposed skin. The cold seeped into every layer of clothing Jake and his friends wore, the remnants of snow coating everything in sight. As they huddled under their makeshift shelter, trying to keep the foal warm and comfort the old Mustang, the weight of the situation pressed heavily on Jake's chest. He had seen the harsh realities of ranch life for decades, but this was something else, something that reached beyond survival. It was a matter of love, sacrifice, and an unspoken bond between creatures that couldn't be easily explained. Jake looked down at the Mustang, whose dark eyes never strayed far from the foal. The old stallion was still standing, but he was weakening by the minute. His breath came in shallow bursts, and his legs trembled with every shift he made. The injuries were far worse than Jake had initially realized, and despite the emergency care, the Mustang was fading fast. Jake had seen animals like this before, old warriors who fought until the end, who sacrificed everything for the ones they loved. But this time, it felt different. This stallion wasn't just any horse. He was Ghostwalker, the legend of the wild horses in these parts. And now, as the wind howled around them, Jake was witnessing his final act of heroism. Miguel stood beside Jake, watching the Mustang carefully. "He's not going to make it much longer, is he?" Miguel asked, his voice barely audible over the wind. Jake shook his head, his face grim. "I don't think so. He's too far gone." He paused, looking down at the foal, who was slowly starting to show signs of life. "But he's fought for that little one. He won't give up." Tom was kneeling beside the foal, carefully checking its vitals and making sure the warming blankets were still effective. He glanced up, meeting Jake's eyes. "He's strong. This one's a fighter too, but we need to move fast." Jake turned his attention back to the Mustang. He could feel the old stallion's gaze on him, the weight of his stare heavy with the understanding that this was the end. Ghostwalker had done everything he could for the foal. Now, it was up to them to make sure the foal survived the storm that was still howling around them. The situation was dire. The men needed to make a decision fast, whether to stay with the horses in the storm and risk the chance of both of them succumbing to the cold, or to try and get them to shelter. The risk of moving them, especially the Mustang, was high. The old stallion had been guarding the foal for hours, and moving him could trigger an instinctual defense that might make the situation even more dangerous. Jake wasn't sure the Mustang would let them. As he contemplated the next step, his mind wandered to the stories he'd heard about Ghostwalker. The stallion was a protector, a guardian of the wild herd. For years, wildlife researchers had tracked him, documenting his remarkable acts of kindness toward orphaned foals. Ghostwalker had taken in several young ones, adopting them as his own, offering them the protection they needed to survive in the harsh Wyoming wilderness. Jake had heard rumors that Ghostwalker had been in danger of losing his place as the herd's leader. The old stallion was getting older, and the younger, stronger stallions were beginning to challenge him. But despite this, Ghostwalker had continued to protect the herd, even if it meant putting his own survival at risk. Now, Jake was witnessing the legacy of that protection with his own eyes. "We've got to help him," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. "We can't let him go alone, not after all he's done." Tom nodded. "What do you want to do?" Jake was quiet for a moment, his mind racing. He knew the only chance they had to save both horses was to get them out of the storm. But he also knew that Ghostwalker wasn't going to give up his post easily. He had been guarding the foal for so long that it would take more than a simple gesture to convince him to let go. Jake took a deep breath and slowly stood up, walking toward the Mustang. The old stallion didn't flinch, but Jake could see the weariness in his eyes. He was fighting for every breath, and yet his gaze was steady, unwavering as he watched Jake approach. "Easy, big fella," Jake murmured, trying to calm the Mustang. "We're not here to hurt you. We just need to get you both out of the storm. Let us help." The Mustang's nostrils flared, and for a moment, Jake thought the stallion might react violently. But instead, the Mustang shifted slightly, enough for Jake to see the foal beneath him more clearly. The baby was still unconscious, but its breathing was steady, a hopeful sign that it could survive if they acted quickly. Jake knelt down beside the foal and carefully checked its vitals. It was cold, its body still stiff from the freezing temperatures, but it was alive. The warmth of the emergency blanket seemed to be working, and Jake could feel the little one's heart beating in time with his own. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The foal wasn't out of the woods yet, but it was a start. "Tom, Miguel, we need to move fast," Jake said, standing up and turning to his friends. "We've got one shot at this. We're going to build a shelter right here. We can't move them, not yet." Tom's eyes widened. "Are you sure?" "We're risking everything here, Jake." Jake nodded firmly. "We don't have a choice. This is Ghostwalker's legacy, and we're going to honor it." The three men quickly sprang into action, moving as quickly as they could despite the freezing conditions. They worked together, using tarps and ropes to create a makeshift shelter around the horses, blocking out the worst of the wind. Miguel worked on the foal, making sure it stayed warm, while Tom and Jake did everything they could to keep the Mustang from further injury. As the hours passed, the storm began to ease slightly, but the tension between the men and the Mustang remained thick. The old stallion hadn't moved much, but he hadn't let the foal out of his sight. Every now and then, his head would lift slightly, watching them with tired but determined eyes. Jake sat beside the Mustang, his heart heavy with the weight of the moment. The old horse was fighting to the very end, but Jake knew that the end was near. The Mustang's strength was fading, but his spirit was still as strong as ever. Suddenly, the Mustang's ears flicked, and he let out a soft, weary nicker. His body swayed, as if he was summoning the last of his strength. Jake felt his stomach drop. He knew what was coming. Ghostwalker wasn't going to make it. The old stallion stepped forward, gently nudging the foal closer to Jake and Tom. He gave a final, soft nicker, as if to say goodbye. Jake's heart broke. He could see it in the Mustang's eyes, the fierce love and dedication that had carried him all these years. It wasn't just instinct, it was a choice, and the Mustang had made that choice to the very end. "I'll take care of her," Jake whispered to the Mustang. "I promise." The Mustang let out one last breath, a deep, ragged exhale that seemed to shake the very air around them. His head drooped, and he collapsed onto the snow, his body sinking slowly into the cold, as if releasing the weight of a lifetime's burden. The storm had stopped, and the silence that followed felt like an eternity. Jake sat still for a long time, his hand resting on the Mustang's cold coat. His friends sat quietly beside him, understanding the magnitude of the loss. But the foal, the baby horse, was still alive. And that was all that mattered now. The storm had broken, but the night was far from over. The wind had finally subsided, but the frigid cold clung to the land like a predator waiting to strike again. Jake sat quietly beside the fallen Mustang, his hands trembling, not from the cold, but from the weight of the moment. The old stallion, Ghostwalker, was gone. His sacrifice had ensured the foal's survival, but the cost had been everything he had left. Jake's thoughts churned, but he could only focus on one thing: the foal. Luna, as they had decided to name her, was now the responsibility of the men who had witnessed Ghostwalker's final act of love and protection. She was just a baby, no more than a few weeks old, fragile and vulnerable in a world that had already taken so much from her. But Luna's spirit was strong. Even in her exhaustion, her tiny form exuded an energy that made it clear she wasn't ready to give up. Jake gently placed his hand on the foal's side, feeling her ribs rise and fall in shallow breaths. Her eyes were closed, but she made soft sounds, little whinnies of confusion and discomfort. Her world had been turned upside down, and though she could no longer feel the warmth of Ghostwalker's body against hers, his protection had left an indelible mark. Miguel, still kneeling nearby, rubbed his hands together, trying to get the feeling back in his fingers. "She's a fighter, Jake. Just like him." Jake nodded. "Yeah, she is." The cold was unbearable, but it wasn't just the temperature that gnawed at Jake's soul. It was the loss of Ghostwalker, the sacrifice of a protector who had fought for a life he hadn't even given birth to. Wild horses had long been symbols of strength and freedom, but Ghostwalker had been more than that. He had been a guardian, a protector who had taken on the mantle of leadership even in his final days. His story, the story of his sacrifice, would live on, not just in his herd, but in the hearts of those who witnessed the truth of it. Tom and Miguel set to work, trying to make the best of the situation. They'd already set up the makeshift shelter using tarps, ropes, and whatever supplies they had left. But even with the storm subsiding, they knew they had limited time to get Luna to safety. The nearest animal sanctuary was still a half-day's drive away, and they couldn't risk waiting. The longer Luna stayed in the storm's aftermath, the greater the chance her fragile body would succumb to the elements. "We need to get her out of here, Jake," Tom said, his voice rough with emotion. "She needs to be warm, fed, and she's got to be safe. We can't keep her out here any longer." Jake knew Tom was right. But moving Luna, especially after everything that had happened, was no simple task. They couldn't just throw a rope around her and drag her to safety like they would with cattle. This was a wild foal, orphaned and alone in the world. She was still recovering, and the physical and emotional toll on her was significant. Moving her would be risky, especially given the trauma she had just gone through. "We've got to get Ghostwalker's body moved too," Jake said softly, his voice filled with resolve. "We can't leave him here like this, not after everything he did for her." Miguel looked up, his face somber. "But moving him, won't that just make things harder?" Jake glanced at the body of the old stallion, now cold and still in the snow. "I know, but he deserves better than this. He fought for that little one. The least we can do is give him a proper resting place." The three men shared a long look. The weight of the decision hung in the air, but there was no arguing it. Ghostwalker had earned his rest, and the men owed him that much. Working together, the men carefully moved Ghostwalker's body to a nearby flat area. They dug a small hole in the frozen earth and laid the Mustang to rest, covering him with the snow and marking the spot with a simple wooden cross. It wasn't much, but it was all they could give him. By the time they finished, the sky had begun to show signs of light. Dawn was breaking, and the storm was nearly over. The men gathered around Luna, who was still lying quietly in the shelter. She seemed calmer now, but she was still weak. Jake knelt beside her, his hand resting on her small, trembling body. "Hey there, little one," Jake whispered, his voice rough. "We've got a long way to go, but we'll take care of you. I promise." He gently ran his fingers over her coat, feeling the warmth of her body slowly returning. She wasn't out of danger yet, but the immediate threat of the storm had passed. And now it was time to focus on the future. Tom stood beside Jake, watching the foal. "What now, Jake?" "We can't just take her back to the ranch. She needs more than that. She needs care. She needs people who understand wild horses." Jake thought for a moment. He knew Tom was right. They couldn't keep her on the ranch. She was wild, born into the harsh realities of the wilderness, and as much as Jake and his friends had the skills to care for animals, there was only so much they could do. "There's a sanctuary up north," Jake said after a long pause. "They specialize in wild horses. They'll know how to help her, how to raise her right. It's the best place for her." "Then we get moving," Miguel said, determination in his voice. "We can't waste any more time." With the decision made, the men carefully packed their gear and prepared for the long journey ahead. The road would be treacherous, especially after the storm, but they had no other choice. Ghostwalker had given them the foal's life, and now it was their turn to give her a chance. As they carefully loaded Luna into the back of the truck, Jake glanced back at the place where Ghostwalker had fallen. The image of the old stallion, fighting to the end to protect the foal, was seared into his mind. He would never forget the sacrifice that had been made, and neither would the world. The journey northward was slow and difficult. The snow had made the roads treacherous, and the truck crept along at a snail's pace, the wheels slipping in the slush and ice. But through it all, Jake kept his eyes on the road ahead. The foal's future was uncertain, but it was a future that had to be fought for. The legacy of Ghostwalker was now in their hands. As they finally approached the sanctuary, Jake felt a strange sense of peace. The journey had been long, and it had cost them more than they'd anticipated. But there was hope now. Hope that Luna would grow into the protector that Ghostwalker had been. Hope that she would carry his legacy forward, just as he had carried the responsibility of guarding the herd. They arrived at the sanctuary just as the sun was beginning to set. The staff was ready for them, and the moment Luna was unloaded, she was taken inside for a full evaluation. Jake and his friends stood back, watching as the young foal was whisked away for care. They knew that the hardest part was over, but there was still a long road ahead for Luna, and for them. As Jake looked out over the snow-covered plains, he thought about the lessons he had learned. The sacrifice of Ghostwalker wasn't just a story. It was a truth that ran deep in the heart of the wilderness. A story about love, loyalty, and the lengths we go to protect those we care about. Jake didn't know what the future held for Luna, but he did know one thing. Ghostwalker's legacy would live on, in the heart of this little foal who had been saved by love. It had been 3 months since that fateful night in the Wyoming blizzard. The storm had long since passed, and the land had begun to recover from its fury. Yet, for Jake Morrison, Tom, and Miguel, the memory of Ghostwalker's selfless sacrifice remained as vivid as ever. It was a cold reminder of the old Mustang's heroism, and the responsibility they had inherited in keeping his legacy alive. The Wild Horse Sanctuary had become Luna's new home, and in the weeks since her arrival, the young foal had flourished in ways they hadn't expected. Gone were the days of fear and uncertainty. Luna had found her footing, though the shadow of her protector Ghostwalker loomed large over her. Jake often found himself thinking about the foal, wondering if she remembered the old stallion's protective warmth and love. But the staff at the sanctuary assured him that she was growing strong, slowly but surely. They had kept her close to the other foals, allowing her to socialize and learn the ways of the wild horses. And each day, as she took small steps toward independence, Luna seemed to mirror the very essence of Ghostwalker. It was early spring, and Jake had made the long journey back to the sanctuary to check on Luna. He pulled into the dirt lot, the truck's tires crunching on the gravel. The air was fresh with the scent of new growth, but there was an underlying coldness that reminded him of the harsh winter they had all just endured. He had visited a few times since the storm, but today felt different. Today, something inside him told him that Luna's transformation was complete. He stepped out of the truck, taking a deep breath, and looked around. The sanctuary had always been a place of refuge for wild horses, but in the months since Ghostwalker's passing, it had become more. A place of healing and renewal, not just for the animals, but for the people who had been touched by the Mustang's story. As Jake approached the pens, he saw a few of the other horses grazing peacefully. The sanctuary staff greeted him warmly, and the usual chatter and bustle of the place felt comforting. But as his eyes scanned the horses, he spotted her, the foal who had been protected so fiercely. Luna stood apart from the group, her head high, her dark eyes scanning the open space like she owned it. She was no longer the frightened little foal who had been sheltered by Ghostwalker's warmth. She had grown into something more, something that made Jake's heart swell with pride. "She's really come into her own," the sanctuary director, Dr. Sarah Winters, said as she approached Jake. Her expression was one of quiet admiration. "We've been keeping an eye on her, and she's a natural." Jake's gaze remained fixed on Luna. She was grazing with a group of older foals, but it was clear she was different. Her movements were confident, her posture proud. She wasn't just part of the herd, she was becoming a leader, much like Ghostwalker had been. "You see it too, don't you?" Dr. Winters asked, her voice tinged with emotion. She's inherited his spirit. Jake nodded, unable to speak for a moment. His throat tightened as he watched Luna interact with the others. She wasn't just fitting in, she was taking charge. When another foal hesitated at the edge of the group, Luna moved toward it, nudging it gently as if guiding it back to the others. She was a protector, just like Ghostwalker had been, and Jake knew, deep in his soul, that her journey had just begun. Dr. Winters smiled softly, recognizing the pride in Jake's eyes. She's ready for the next step. We've seen her take charge in the herd, and it's clear she's ready to move forward. We'd like to introduce her to a new group of orphans who've been brought in. We think she'll be a big help to them. Jake's heart skipped a beat. The moment he had feared and hoped for had come. Ghostwalker's legacy was not just about survival. It was about protecting the next generation. And Luna had the spirit to do just that. You mean she's going to take on the same role? Jake asked, his voice full of awe. Yes, Dr. Winters replied. She's already shown signs of becoming a leader. It's time for her to step up and become the protector, just like Ghostwalker did. Jake stood for a moment, his eyes never leaving Luna. He saw the way she moved with purpose, the way she asserted her presence in the herd. It was as if Ghostwalker's spirit had been passed on to her, not just in the way she behaved, but in the way she carried herself, with grace, dignity, and fierce determination. We can't let her go back out there without making sure she's ready, Jake said quietly, though there was no doubt in his voice. We need to help her transition, just like we did with Ghostwalker. Dr. Winters nodded. We'll be with her every step of the way. The next few days were a blur of activity. Jake stayed at the sanctuary, working with the staff to ensure Luna was fully prepared to take on her new role. They introduced her to the orphaned foals, and it didn't take long before Luna was fully immersed in her duties. She was patient with the young ones, guiding them with the same gentle strength that Ghostwalker had shown her. Jake watched with a mixture of pride and sadness. Ghostwalker's death had been a blow to them all, but in Luna, his legacy was living on. As the days passed, Luna grew more and more confident, and her leadership abilities became increasingly clear. She took to the role of protector naturally, never hesitating to stand between the younger foals and any danger, real or imagined. And as Luna grew, so did the sanctuary. The new group of orphaned foals flourished under her watchful eye, and it wasn't long before Luna became known as the new guardian of the herd. But Jake knew that her journey was far from over. She was still young, still learning, and the challenges of the wild would soon test her. But in his heart, he knew Luna was ready. She had inherited more than just Ghostwalker's strength. She had inherited his spirit, his heart. As Luna matured, Jake continued to visit the sanctuary, watching from a distance as the foal became a protector. She carried the mantle of Ghostwalker with pride, just as he had, and in time, Jake realized that the lessons they had learned from the wild Mustang weren't just about survival. They were about love, love that transcended species, love that lived on in the next generation. One evening, as Jake stood at the edge of the sanctuary, watching Luna lead the herd into the twilight, he realized the truth. Ghostwalker had given his life for the foal because he believed in something greater than himself. He had believed in the future, in the continuation of the herd, and in the unspoken bond that tied them all together. As Luna moved gracefully through the fading light, Jake felt a deep sense of peace. Ghostwalker's legacy was alive in her, and with that, he knew the wild had a future. A future where love, sacrifice, and the strength of the herd would continue to live on, no matter what. The story of Ghostwalker, The Mustang who had given everything for his herd would never be forgotten. And in Luna, the new guardian, it would continue forever.